Good morning and welcome, everyone. We're going to wait a few minutes for our attendees to join us. So welcome and happy Friday, everyone. As you're joining us, if you would like to, in the chat box, put your name and tell us what institution you're joining from. So again, welcome, everyone, to the continuation of the ILEA Initiative Lessons Learned. I want to take a moment on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Partnership for College Completion to recognize that this is a very happy time on most college campuses as you celebrate graduation and all the efforts that it has taken to ensure that students leave your institutions with a degree or certificate. So congratulations to all the work that you've done over the last few years with your students to get them across the finish line. So again, we have some folks joining us. My name is Paula Hanley. I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager for the Partnership for College Completion. Lisette, you can go to the next slide. And then the next slide. So our agenda today, we're going to give you a brief overview of PCC. We're going to give you a quick recap of the first conversation that we had in March. We're going to cover reflections on the ILEA initiative and the impact in Illinois higher education. We're going to share some of the lessons learned from the ILEA initiative. And then we have a partners panel. So we have 3 representatives from 3 of our ILEA institutions that are going to share their reflections. And then we're going to go to some questions and discussions at the end. So at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Lisa Castillo-Richmond, who is the Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion.
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be in community with all of you. Thank you for joining us today. I am thrilled to be in community with so many equity practitioners and others who are engaged in this work in the state of Illinois and across the country. I'm so thrilled to be joined by a number of my colleagues today, both those at PCC and those within our ILEA institutions who have done this incredible work over the past 6 or more years. And I really look forward to sharing more about this with all of you today and having you hear their stories directly from them. Slide. So just to briefly give an overview of the PCC and what we're trying to do here. Many of you know us very well, but the Partnership for College Completion is a nonprofit organization that takes a systems change look to address college completion, access, affordability, and higher education equity for low-income students, first-generation college goers, and students of color in Illinois, particularly Black and Latinx students. And we're a pretty young organization. We got our start in 2016 in the state. And we were the first organization dedicated exclusively to higher education equity as a policy advocacy practice organization. Slide. So this just speaks a little bit about how we fit in the ecosystem of organizations doing this work in Illinois. As I mentioned, we were the first to be very focused exclusively on higher education. We have a number of partners in this space that focus on different aspects, including higher education, that we work very closely with. But PCC really was the first to kind of focus on what is happening in our colleges and universities in the state, and what is the state doing to support our students in colleges and universities. We could never do this alone. We are deeply dependent on a coalition of partners at the campus level, equity practitioners across the state, experts across the state and country who have taught us how to do things. But we are deeply based on a partnership and collaboration as it is in our name. PCC has also been focused on really using data and research and evidence to tell the story of what has been happening in our higher education system through policy choices, through practice efforts, through long-term history of doing things in a certain way, and also centering students in this conversation. So elevating student voice to help us identify what are the challenges and what are the opportunities for addressing these challenges. And as a trusted partner, PCC has really worked to have, real meaningful, deep relationships with folks doing this work, as I mentioned, at different places and different spaces across the state, so that we can really try to put thoughtful and best in class solutions in place that really will have a tangible impact for students and families in the state of Illinois. Slide. Now, one of the things that's unique about PCC is how we do this work. So we have many peers in different places that do public policy and advocacy work, or that support colleges and universities at the campus level, that use data and research to do this work in an applied way to bring research to bear on practice and policy change. But I think one thing that really is unique about PCC, and that makes this work both powerful and helps us do this work, but also makes it challenging, is the fact that we do both public policy and advocacy at the state level on these issues of higher education equity. But we also have these very strong partnerships of doing this work at the ground level. So we're going to be speaking today about our ILEA initiative and how we have learned through that particular set of partnerships and relationships at the campus level to advance equity and student outcomes. However, PCC has also started to do policy implementation work to support institutions in deploying more complex institutional change efforts as legislation has passed to support this work at the state level. Doing those things together is not without its challenges, but we firmly believe that good policy starts and ends at the campus level. Slide. So this is our second webinar of a two-part series. We are recording these. Many people have asked us over time how our institutions did that work, why we did this work. And so we really wanted to spend some time across these two 90-minute sessions. The first one is recorded if you weren't able to join us, to really talk about the what, the why, and the how. So in our last session, we covered an overview of the initiative. We talked about the equity planning process, leadership supports, different kinds of programming PCC offered, why we did this in a community of practice format. We talked about some of the equity plan strategies and the 500 measurable metrics that were found within them. We talked a lot about some of the particular strategies we saw in terms of first-year experience, cohort modeling, pathways, academic advising, and course redesign. And we also brought in our partners at NORC at the University of Chicago, who, along with partners at Fordham University, conducted a study over the course of 3 to 4 years where they took a look at the ILEA initiative and specifically took a look at 6 colleges and universities within the study and shared some key takeaways of what they learned from that experience and how other institutions and communities of practice can learn from doing the same. So what is the ILEA initiative? We're going to talk today about a lot about the why and the how and lessons learned. So this really was a community collaborative effort to catalyze urgent action on campuses for longstanding racial and socioeconomic disparities in student outcomes particularly those that are most significant in the state of Illinois and similarly across the country, which are for Black students, Latinx students, and students from low-income households. Slide. When we got started on this, we really expected, and I think this is an important part of the story. At the time, PCC was a very young organization. Institutions were doing some of this work on their own on their campuses across the state. There was no state policy or mandate to engage in this. There were no equity plan legislation. There was no funding that PCC had to give institutions to encourage them to join the initiative. It really was, an effort to go one by one to a group of diverse institutions and say, we are going to start a community of practice. This is why we're doing this. This is what we hope to achieve, and we'd like you to be a part of it. And so we expected it to be hard. We wanted to originally have a cohort of maybe 10 to 15 institutions that were diverse, so 2- and 4-year public and private nonprofit institutions. And we expected, it to be challenging. We wanted to strike a balance between how could we make an initiative where it wasn't just folks standing on a stage saying, of course, yes, we support equity, we'll join you in this effort. But we also didn't want to make it so difficult, because this work is difficult to begin with, where institutions would just not be able to meet the standards that we were putting forth or asking them to do, because the real work we understood needed to happen at the campus level. So we were really trying to strike a balance for that. And what I will say here is that when we first launched in the fall of 2018, we had almost an even split across the 25 institutions of 2-year and 4-year institutions. And amongst the 4-year institutions, a balance of public universities and private nonprofit institutions. When we put a piece in place that we had said from the beginning, which was to share disaggregated data with PCC over time, so to be transparent about some of those disparities, our 4 most selective institutions, which was 2 public universities and 2 private institutions, decided not to stay in the cohort. I think that was also an expected part of our learning in this. These are risky endeavors, right? Sharing these disparities, for which all institutions have, the majority of institutions have disparities on some level, makes institutions vulnerable. And so I do want to recognize the courage required of these institutions standing up to do this, and to stay engaged in the effort over time to share disaggregated data, was monumental and was important, in addition to the significant time they spent in this work. Slide. So in assembling the original cohort, I want to focus on a few things of how we did this and why we did it, because the design of this really informed what institutions were doing on the campuses. So first, it was about case making. How did we even recruit these institutions to join this collaborative? We showed institutions data on their own completion disparities from publicly available sources. We talked about the financial value of retaining students. We also talked about statewide data on enrollment, completion, and affordability, and juxtaposed that nationally with other states. We required a senior leadership team to steer the work. This was informed by the research. ILEA teams had to include the president and 5 to 12 senior leaders, in addition to 1 to 2 faculty who could attend programming and events, and smaller core teams to steer the work from week to week. We also had a set of core values we talked more about in the first session, that guided this work. And really, I think the most important part of that was that colleges and universities needed to believe that they are responsible for graduating all of their degree-seeking students. And the goal was unapologetic. It wasn't that we would eliminate all of the disparities on each of our campuses in a few short years, but it was that we believed with urgency that that was what we were aspiring to do, and that over time we could get there. Slide. So when we pulled data together, and this is part of the case making with institutions, and I'm going to spend a couple of slides talking about this, We wanted to show, and this also speaks to why we wanted a diverse cohort of institutions. We wanted to show that regardless of institution type, regardless of selectivity, we see these kinds of racial disparities and also socioeconomic disparities across all institution types. And so everyone has some work to do in this area in terms of student success and equity on their campuses. And so I think this was important both to show, yes, you individually have work to do, but also your peers do as well. You are not an outlier in the sense that many institutions have these significant disparities. They've existed historically for a very long time. You, the team we're speaking with, did not create these, but you have the opportunity and the responsibility to address them at this time. In case baking, we talked about a number of things, as I alluded to a couple slides earlier. So we talked about undergraduate enrollment in Illinois. And if you recall, this was in 2016-17, we were having these conversations. So we were mostly using data from 2015 and 16. So at that point in time, again, this is probably pretty well known to all of you at this point, but at this time, it really wasn't talked about in the same way. Undergraduate enrollment of students of color in Illinois had increased in the prior 10 years from 37% to almost half of total enrollment by 2016. But, there were a couple of issues with this. Number one, this meant that a number of PWIs, historically white institutions serving a majority white student body, had shifted. There were dozens of Hispanic serving institutions in the state, minority serving institutions, a couple of predominantly Black institutions in the state. And the populations in many, not all, but in many of these many of these institutions had changed dramatically in the 5 or 10 years preceding. And we wanted to take a look at and provide support for institutions in ensuring their equity practices were aligned with their student populations. Compared to their peers, this is another data point we showed, Black and Latinx students in the state tended to be more highly concentrated in community colleges, and Black students also in for-profit institutions in the state. Using 2015 IPEDS data, and this was one of the more sobering charts in our presentation, Illinois was 47th in terms of the size of the graduation disparities between Black and white students at our 4-year institutions, which was about 33% disparity across the board. And then also from 2011 to 2015, we saw a dramatic decrease in Black undergraduate enrollment in our public institutions in the state, which was very alarming and has gotten a lot more attention and resources in the past few years. Additionally, we wanted to make the case for issues of affordability and disinvestment at the state level were a major culprit in this work. Slide. So on the affordability front, these were some of the pretty shocking statistics at the time that we pulled forth. And again, this is more common to understand now, but I think it still resonates. So in 2016 alone, there were 100,000 students who qualified for MAP, but MAP grants had run out by this time. In 2013, it was the highest year of MAP suspensions, with almost 170,000 qualified students not getting a MAP grant. I mean, this is direct correlation to enrollment declines that we saw in the state. And between 2005 and 18, there were cumulatively more than 1 million MAP grants that were not available to qualified students. And also we pointed out that few Illinois universities, and again, these are public institutions that serve the whole state. They're not like community colleges that serve particular regions or geographies. Few of them served representative populations of Black and Latinx students as compared to populations in the state. And one of the things that we showed to make a personal case for this was Kyle. Kyle was our founding executive director. He went to one of our public universities in the state, and he showed the aid that he got back when he went to college, when he started college in 1991. With the grants here, you see his unmet need was $186. Kyle, if he was attending this institution in 2016, when we pulled this data together, would have had more than a $13,000 gap for just his first year of college. And that is substantial, depending on family income. Slide. So what do we focus on in terms of institutional change? We focus a lot on equity plan development and implementation. You'll hear from our campus leaders and how that supported their work at the campus level. We really talked about the role of campus leadership, the buy-in and visible leadership of institutional leaders, including the president or chancellor. We said and the research supports this, but we also saw this empirically over the course of the years of this initiative, that it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for success at the campus level on equity change. You must achieve critical mass of other leaders, of faculty, of student supports, of academic affairs and student affairs. It must be a broad-based campus initiative. And then we were really talking about institutional policy and practice change. How can we utilize data to understand where we needed to make shifts that were not supporting student success? Slide. This shows how we did this over time, from the launch in 2018 through to the programming that I'm going to speak briefly about now, to the conclusion of our inaugural cohort at the end of this academic year, and as we're reflecting on through these webinars. Slide. So from ambition to implementation, really, this was about a collective action. It wouldn't have been the same if we were just individually working with single institutions. This was really about bringing folks together across similarity and across difference of institution to be supportive, to be foundational, to normalize what institutions were seeing on their campuses, to talk about how challenging and difficult this work is, to remove, stigmas and blame, and to normalize the practice of investigating your institution. I think one of the things that I talk a lot with other equity practitioners is that many of our colleges and universities are not learning organizations. And that seems very odd to say that about, higher education institutions, but this really implicates how we learn and apply that learning in institutions to do differently and to do better. And doing that in community was a very powerful part of this work. Slide. We also wanted to talk about and center the conversation about equity. What did we mean when we were talking about equity? And when we started, some practitioners, some institutions were very familiar with these kinds of framings of equity, but it caused a necessary conversation on a number of individual campuses and across the state about what do we mean when we talk about equity. We are not talking about reducing rigor. We are not talking about reducing our standards. We are talking about understanding that the image here on the left is not what we are dealing with. While we may have thought that, or some of us may have thought that, that is not how our students are starting. They're starting from very different places, and the pathways that they're taking to get there are not, a similar straight ladder with the same number of rungs. So this conversation occupied a lot of time in the first 2 to 3 years. Slide. We also talked about other partnerships that really leveraged resources across the country. So we did things like engaging faculty. We did things specifically for leadership through workshops. We did lots of webinars, especially after COVID began. We did a syllabus workshop with faculty. We centered faculty in this work because they are the scale within the institution, and understanding what happens in the classroom and the considerable amount of time that students spend with faculty is definitely game changing and is one of the critical levers for success in this work in the long term. Slide. These equity plans, again, setting goals, and our data and research team momentarily are going to talk about this. Thinking about what would be meaningful goals for our partners in this initiative. These were all different kinds of institutions serving different student populations at different points in their equity journeys. Like, how could we actually set goals that would be meaningful across a cohort of institutions? And so where we landed with this was that each institution was looking at reducing and ultimately eliminating the disparities they saw between student groups on their campuses based on their student populations. It was not a perfect process, but at least it gave everyone, a consistent effort across institutions, but again, was personalized to the work they were doing on their own college or university campuses. Slide. We also built partnerships with groups like Achieving the Dream, who were, seasoned technical support providers. One of our first efforts was with Achieving the Dream. They had an assessment tool, institutional capacity assessment, ICAT, that PCC contracted and worked with ATD to come into every single campus and have these conversations. In each of these areas you see in this chart here really talked about how do we look at what we're doing at the campus level, so this can inform our process for developing our equity plans and leaning into certain strategies based on some of the challenges and opportunities and resources we see on our own campuses. Slide. We also did work at the leadership level, as I mentioned previously. We partnered with the Aspen Institute on an Equity Academy for Presidents and Cabinets. This was sort of like a sub-program of the overall ILEA initiative where presidents and cabinets who wanted to join us could do this. These were each year-long efforts. We hoped that they would be in person, but then COVID changed that. So these were online workshops that took place. We had 4 or 5 of these per year. And over the course of the 2 years, we had 18 of the ILEA institutions participate. Slide. And the leadership aspect of this is something I think is really interesting. We know this from existing research and things we learned in this initiative that the president is critical to the success of this work. Many people have been working on equity efforts in campuses across the state and nation for years. And often it looks like pockets of excellence or small programs. And many times these programs are wildly successful in supporting student persistence and completion, but without the aligned leadership aspect of this, these typically stay programs instead of systems level change efforts. Slide. And we see this, there's been less research done at the team level, but there is emerging research about this role. And what we see here is that it needs to be coordinated across the campus. It has to be diffuse and loosely controlled, and that trust and relationships at the campus level is a critical component of this work as well. And finally, my colleagues are going to talk more about this now, but our strategic data partnership was with the National Student Clearinghouse. And this was something that, we knew we needed a data component of this. As a small nonprofit at the time this launched, we had 10 staff, 4 of them were dedicated, 3.5 of them were dedicated to this particular initiative over time. And we really wanted to look at institutional data disaggregated. We wanted to provide a resource and an interface for institutions that also had, a variety of institutional research departments. Some people had 1 person, some people had 5. That was really disparate across the different institutions, but we wanted to be able to both provide a resource and be able to see data so that we could learn through this initiative. And you'll hear more about some of the strengths and weaknesses of that approach in a minute. Slide. And with that, I'd like to pass to my colleagues, Mike Abrahamson and Giselle Palacios.
Thank you, Lisa. Slide. So before I jump into the lessons learned, I wanted to give you an idea of how we categorized them and some of the common themes that emerged. As we reflected on the lessons learned through our work with ILEA, we organized them into 2 key categories, which were data sharing and evaluation in a partnership. So the lessons on data sharing emerged from the challenges that institutions faced in submitting the data, as well as the challenges that PCC encountered in analyzing it due to some inconsistencies in the data collection process. The lessons related to evaluation in a partnership stem from our reflections on how we could have strengthened the collaboration between PCC and our ILEA partners. And so these lessons are not only from the challenges we faced and how we might address them moving forward, but they also include insights from our partners through the positive feedback that we've been receiving the past few years. And so as we walk through these lessons, you're going to notice some common themes like capacity building, clear communication and alignment, and equity-focused partnerships, and also data-driven decision-making. Slide. And so I'm going to start by talking about some of the lessons learned related to data sharing. Slide. So I'm going to start by showing this table again. I showed it in the first webinar, and it might look like a simple summary table now, but it actually represents a lengthy and complex process to get here. So to collect the data, as Lisa mentioned, PCC had access to student-level data from ILEA institutions through the PDP, or the Post-Secondary Data Partnership. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the PDP, it gathers data on early momentum metrics, long-term cohort outcomes, and non-cohort metrics. And it also allows us to disaggregate by race, post status, and other key student characteristics. And so we used both the dashboards that are available on the PDP portal as well as the student-level files to conduct our own analysis. And so then we reviewed all 25 equity plans, and we identified leading and lagging indicators and determined if those indicators were available on the PDP or in some public data set. Then we mapped all 240 strategies to one or more indicators. So for example, one strategy may be linked to 2 leading indicators and 1 lagging indicator, depending on its intended outcome. And finally, we analyzed trends and those indicators from 2019, which was the year before ILEA was launched, to 2021, disaggregated by race, pulse status, and first-generation status. And so more than 50 of the strategies were linked to improving retention rates, but some other commonly used indicators were credit completion and first-year GPA. And so some of the key takeaways that I shared in the first webinar were that we did see some improvements and also some declines, but most of the changes were modest, like typically ranging from 1 to 5 percentage points. And of course, the pandemic happened right at the start of ILEA, which impacted student outcomes. And that said, we don't have the counterfactuals, so we can't say for certain about what would have happened if ILEA efforts hadn't continued through the pandemic. And so that's just something important to keep in mind when we're interpreting this table. Slide. And so in the last webinar, I also showed this slide as a preview to today's presentation. I talked about the challenges we faced analyzing ILEA outcomes, that many of which stem from the PDP data collection. And the biggest issue was inconsistency. So data submissions varied from year to year, making it difficult to track progress for the ILEA cohort as a whole. And so this raises some important questions. Is the data complete? Is it representative? And therefore, is it accurate? And in many cases, the PDP dashboards reflected gaps in the data, preventing us from getting a full picture. So we ended up doing a lot more data maintenance on our end than we expected. And to validate our findings, we cross-referenced the PDP data with like IPEDS data or college scorecard data. But even that approach had some limitations because many of the metrics we were looking at are not publicly available, or they're not disaggregated by race or income, which is why we turned to the PDP in the first place. So now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the understanding why bullet point on the next slide. So one challenge that we didn't fully anticipate at the beginning of ILEA was the limited capacity that some of the institutions had for deep data work. Like us, many of our ILEA partners had a small data team, sometimes just 1 or 2 people, and in some cases they struggled to analyze their own data or to even submit it. So here's our first lesson. Data capacity varies widely across institutions. That means partner organizations like PCC need to provide support through a dedicated data team. And so the PDP collects a massive amount of student-level data, but data capacity building wasn't part of the original plan. And so up until a year and a half ago, PCC's data team consisted of like 1 person, which meant we didn't have the bandwidth to fully explore the PDP data. So I was brought in to really take a deep dive. And over the past year, Mike and I have developed the lengthy data analysis process that I talked about earlier. And this process was not smooth. Anytime you're dealing with incomplete data, things can get very messy. And so it would have been more efficient to have a dedicated data team of more than 2 people in place from the start. And also what we realized in the past year is that the institutions with the least data capacity, so those that were struggling or had the most difficulty to share data, were the ones that had the most to gain from our ILEA data agreement. Meanwhile, the institutions that were already doing this work did not need as much support from us. Slide. So you've been hearing me talk a lot about the PDP. It is a valuable tool that continues to improve. However, ILEA institutions implemented many unique strategies, and we found that PDP isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution, as it limits our ability to evaluate the effectiveness of those diverse strategies. So, for example, many institutions focused on improving academic support services like advising. And so to evaluate this, we'd want to examine outcomes like retention rates for students who engaged in advising versus those who did not, but we weren't able to do this with PDP data. And it's important to note that there was no plan set from the very beginning to do this type of data work. And so there was no plan to collect this kind of data. And it would have been beneficial to have been more thoughtful about this in the beginning, because it could have enabled us to better understand which strategies are making an impact and which ones needed some adjustment. And on top of this, we found that institutions had their own way of defining some of the metrics, which was different than how the PDP defined them. So ultimately, this highlighted how the need for aligned data collection and also for clear defined definitions of key metrics, so that everyone is speaking the same language when we're evaluating student success. And so this brings us to the second lesson learned, the importance of establishing clear and aligned data requirements from the start. And ideally, this would align with the state's mandatory data reporting. This would not only streamline the data collection and reporting process, but also improve consistency, reduce redundancy, and support institutions, especially those that are struggling with compliance. And that's even more important now as the state requires institutions to have their equity plans. Slide. And so now I'm going to pass it on to Mike to talk about our lessons learned related to evaluation in a partnership.
Awesome. Thanks, Giselle. So the first lesson learned that I'll talk about is it comes from some positive feedback, which is we heard from our partner institutions great feedback on our communities of practice and how program managers work with institutions. We think that they're, with de-identified student and course level data, in theory, there's basically limitless opportunities for working with institutions individually and in communities of practice with this data. Again, in theory, right? We could inform those conversations on strategies and best practices, bringing granular data, right? Saying, this is where we're seeing course level, where we're seeing students, like this drop off in completion rates, those kinds of things. However, I will talk more about the constraints that Giselle brought up that prevented us from using the data in that way. I will say overall, the lesson that we took away is that we could apply to kind of a future effort would be that data sharing can and has to be a two-way street, right? Regardless of capacity constraints, providing something like customized data reports to institutions after receiving their data is both essential for the reason that Giselle mentioned, where it can be really useful to institutions, both with less and more data capacity. And also it can, I think, motivate better data collection, which is necessary to have a really well-oiled machine of this kind of data sharing agreement that Giselle was mentioning earlier as well. Slide. So what was the constraint? As Giselle mentioned, it was capacity. First, on institutions and the data ask, it was just too great to get the kind of consistent, uniform, timely data that we needed to realize these most granular of uses. To go back on that example I just gave, the reality of the course level data, and Giselle, you can correct me if this is off, but most of the course level data was not uniform or once we cleaned it, wasn't necessarily usable in a way that we would be able to bring it into these community of practice meetings. Now, of course, we as Giselle talked about, we found that out pretty late in the process because of our own capacity. But her slides showed the limits on the data we received in the form of those pie charts and where it showed the year by year the data that we collected. Which brings us to, on our end, getting literally millions of data points just requires more capacity. Even like calling it a data team, it was me for a lot of it, and I was working a lot in the policy area. We have since scaled up our research and data team. Giselle has been doing phenomenal work with a lot of this data. I will also say that we were able to, throughout this process, share a lot of valuable and unique findings from this data, usually zoom back a little bit, and we shared that regularly at those convenings. overall, we think that that's a success. But we've, compared to the possibilities that I mentioned earlier, and knowing that we're all here focused on progress and improvement, and there isn't really a blueprint for this kind of partnership and how you use data, what we've learned, the net of all of this, is that the best data sharing model is one that works for your goals. It seems very odd for someone in my position, a data person, to say that we needed less data. But the reality is that a more narrow and targeted data solution would have worked better for this initiative, and is something that I think we would advise and consider in future endeavors. Slide. So finally, improving communication of our policy work. Lisa mentioned this up top, but over the years, there has been tension at times between our policy agenda and our practice work. And oftentimes we tried to keep those things separated, right? We tried to walk a line and have certain firewalls, et cetera. We've realized that really the best approach is when we engage our institutions, when we are open about that communication back and forth. And we heard the same from the institutions, is that they really just wanted to be informed of our work and fully informed. And so we learned over time, and think we've kind of hit our stride a little bit better there in terms of how to bring institutions in when we're considering our policy agenda, hear from them, and share very openly and proactively what we're working on in policy. So with that, I will pass it back to Paula.
Thanks, Mike and Giselle. So at this point in time, I would like to introduce our three panelists. President Kimberly Hollingsworth, an East St. Louis native, has over 25 years of experience in higher education. She has been with the City Colleges of Chicago since 1999, serving in numerous roles at Harold Washington, Daly College, Malcolm X College, and now Olive Harvey College, where she has served as the president for the last 7 years. We also have Dr. Carol Sumner. As Northern Illinois University's Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Sumner works to advance the university's diversity, equity, belonging, and inclusion goals in alignment with NIU's mission and values. She joined the NIU team in 2023 after 5 years at Texas Tech University, where she became the first person to hold the university's Chief Diversity Officer title. And also joining us today is Dr. Kathleen Carlson. She serves as the Executive Director of Institutional Research and Special Assistant to the President at St. Xavier University. Dr. Carlson came to St. Xavier University in 1997 after 17 years in Illinois public higher education in both institutional research and as an Associate Dean of Business with faculty rank. At this point in time, I will turn it over to President Hollingsworth, who will tell us a little bit about Olive Harvey College.
Thanks, Paula. I just want to start by saying I am super excited about this conversation. When you asked for me to serve as a panelist, I obviously jumped an opportunity to talk about this process and the experience that we've had with ILEA. And so super excited to be a part of this esteemed panel of colleagues as well. And so to set a little context for our conversation, I thought it was really important to give the audience a sense of the population at Olive Harvey College. Olive Harvey is a comprehensive community college. Obviously, it is open access. We are located on the southeast side of Chicago in the Roseland-Pullman community. And if you look at our demographic information here, and this was part of our statistical digest from 2024, so these numbers are just a little bit off, but are pretty close. If you look at our enrollment, our credit student enrollment is almost 4,000 students now. Our early college enrollment is a huge part of the institution. We have really good working relationships with our high schools in the community, but obviously would love to see those numbers grow. And as they have been growing over the years, we have a really large adult education population with just over 1,000 adult education students. Those are students who are completing a GED or pursuing English as a second language. And one number I'm really proud of is our continuing education student number. When I started 7 years ago, we didn't even offer continuing education courses. So to see that number is actually, I took pause and was like, oh, wow, we're really making a difference in our community, because a lot of those courses under CE are community focused courses. And then looking at our demographics, our Asian population is roughly 6% of the population. We are a federally designated, predominantly Black institution, but we are also an aspiring, an emerging HSI with nearly 25% of our population being Latin. And then you can see the other numbers. Our median age is dropping, and I think that has a lot to do with some of the programs that we are now offering, but has always stayed around 27 to 28 years old. I think we're closer to like 26 years of age as our average age, a median age. Over 33% of our students are first-generation college students, which makes for a really interesting first-year experience for our students. We have dedicated funding now to actually hiring an assistant dean of first-year experience because we know we have so many students who are brand new to college and have no idea what to expect when they walk on our campuses. 40% of our students care for a dependent. 75% of our students are Pell eligible. And when we talk about that data, which I'll talk a little bit about later, that's really compelling. Most of our students are coming in with some form of financial need, and we've been really trying hard, not just at Olive Harvey, but as a district to meet those financial gaps that our students face. IPED's graduation rate at the time was 20%. I think we're closer to 22 to 23% at this point. And our transfer following completion of a 2-year degree is 18.9%. And that's not something that we're really proud of. But we have some very intentional efforts that we have underway and in place, and some big plays across the city colleges that we know will bolster that number in the future. And our fall to spring retention rate, it's one thing about getting students in these seats, and our enrollment has increased tremendously over the years. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. But more importantly is keeping those students in those seats. And our fall to spring retention in 2024 was about 61.8%. We just had a conversation with our decision support team, and that number has increased by nearly 6% since last year. So we're super excited, and I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the strategies that we've used to help to increase our completion and retention rates. But notably, what's not on the screen is I like to mention that nearly 75% of our students come in at the Dev Ed level. Most of our students are not reading at college or math level. So thank you for an opportunity to tell you just a little bit about our student population.
Thank you, President Hollingsworth. And now Dr. Sumner will tell us a little bit about Northern Illinois University.
Well, good morning, all. It is certainly a joy to be here as I reiterate all of the same things that President Hollingsworth shared. I, unlike others, came into Northern Illinois University well after this plan had already been underway. And so I have the benefit of being able to build upon work that had been started before my tenure. At NIU, we have continued to leverage the work that we started in this process and have continued to build. What you see on your screen in front of you is information that is actually taken from our website. So you can learn a little bit about the academic programs, the number of college programs that are available, and where you'll see the top ranking programs that our students choose to enroll in: psychology, health sciences, computer science, business administration, and others. And so we have a high STEM area of interest for our students, but we also have a wonderful School of Visual and Performing Arts. And so across the institution, our students have a wide range of interests. What you'll also see about our institution is that 60% of our students at this R2 regional research institution are students who identify as students of color. We also have over 50% of our students who identify as first-generation college students. And so as we are considering as well the need-based students, we also have a high degree of students who are receiving financial aid who are also Pell eligible. Building on the work that we did as a part of our ILEA plan, you can see we are always proud to share the accomplishments that we have, but the accomplishments aren't why we get them. It is doing the work to serve. And this plan allowed us to really look at equity gaps. Using disaggregated data and learning how to do that allows you to then transition and translate that into other efforts. So in the upper right-hand corner, you'll actually see we are an emerging HSI. And as an emerging HSI, we should receive our full designation in the spring. But we were able to participate in Excellencia in Education's program for examples of Excellencia in our living learning community. Because of the data we were able to provide showing what we had been doing over the last several years, our living learning community for our Latino students was recognized as a program to watch. And so that means we continue to develop data that supports this, but much of this work comes from what we did in the early years as a part of this partnership. So I look forward to more conversation about how we've been able to benefit from this opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sumner. And now Dr. Carlson will tell us a little bit about St. Xavier University.
Thank you. Very happy to be here today. This slide is to focus on the fact that St. Xavier, a Catholic private institution, not for profit, is really unusual as a Catholic institution by our profile. And in many ways, we're more like a public institution. We have about 3,500 students at the moment, but we are tied in the recent US News rankings with Chicago State, with 60% of our students being Pell eligible. And that's number one in the state is Northeastern Illinois at 62%. Over half of our graduates are Hispanic, 12% African American, 29% white. And I might want to preface here that the shift that's happened at St. Xavier over the last 12 years has been phenomenal. Back in 2013, we were about 52% white, and now we are 29% white. And that's all shifted just in the last decade. And it's part of the story of how we got involved and why we are involved and why so critical the ILEA work is. We do a lot of NESE analysis, or NESE, which is for the counterpart of those, the community colleges. I believe there's a SESI instrument, which is equivalent. We find that our students, 3/4 of our students are first gen. And at other Catholic colleges, they're 42%. Over half of our entering freshmen, 53%, work off campus, versus at other Catholic colleges and universities, it's 35%. Half of our freshmen, this is really important to us, spend an average of 5 hours a week caring for other family members. They have family responsibilities, and we are way off the charts for all the other Catholics in this case. The bottom line is that our students, our undergraduates, have much less discretionary time, as is the case at most other Catholic and private universities. Our new president, a relatively new president, Dr. Keith Elder, said something very insightful, and he likes to describe our students as we are traditional age because we are almost entirely, I think our median age is just between 23 and 24. We don't have the adult population we once did. And he said we have a traditional age population with non-traditional responsibilities. So when you think about it, it has to shift our thinking into how we are going to be reallocating and looking at how we deliver our resources and how we are going to be serving our students in the coming years. One other thing I'm going to add here, 1/3 of our entering freshmen have family incomes of less than $30,000 a year. I just want to and we're a private institution, so we have a pretty healthy scholarships and discount rates for students. Two recent studies, the most recent one done in 2024, done by a think tank in Washington on economic mobility. And it looks at how long does it take students with incomes of less than $30,000 to pay off their student debt and to recoup what they paid for college. And I'm happy to say St. Xavier, out of 1,500 institutions examined, we were number 59 in the country. And we were just behind University of Illinois in Chicago. We're very proud of that, and it's something that we aspire to keep. One other thing I'll mention, our president, Elder, has put forth a very ambitious goal for us as an institution. Right now, our overall graduation rate is about 6-year graduation rate is about 55%. He wants us to move to a point where our 4-year graduation rate will be 67%. That's a very tall order, and he's very well aware of that, but that's where we're heading at St. Xavier. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carlson. Can you all hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, I'm having a little trouble with my video, but I'm glad that everyone can still hear me. So this question is for all three of our panelists. I'm going to start with President Hollingsworth. Looking back, what was the starting place for equity efforts on your campus, and what has been the top 1 to 2 difference makers in your equity work over the past 6 or more years?
So, this was probably one of my most favorite questions because it did allow for me to do some reflection of our initial plan. And so when I think about the starting place for equity efforts at Olive Harvey, I really think that it began with a commitment to data transparency and disaggregated student outcomes. And I know we've talked a lot about that already. This wasn't rehearsed. When I heard Lisa say, hey, we sent out these data sets to all of the colleges, I was sitting at the table because she also talked about how presidents were really instrumental in driving this work and getting these plans done. And so when I got that data, it was very disheartening and really a difficult pill to swallow, because I'm going to be quite honest, I don't think that our college at the time realized that we even had an equity issue. Right? We're a predominantly Black institution. It was very easy to play the blame game that we talked about, and that we were the smallest of the city colleges of Chicago, and they weren't, the district wasn't giving us the money we needed to be successful. But we really hadn't taken a real close look at ourselves. And so leadership recognized the disparities in student achievement, particularly among Black and Latinx students. And when you looked at Black and Latinx students compared to white students, and I'm not talking about just white students at Olive Harvey College, because that's a relatively small number. We're talking about scaling it and looking at the white students across the district. We were doing very poorly in comparison. So it was really important for us to make a deliberate shift to place equity at the center of our institutional strategy. And so this included creating space for honest conversations about race. That was something that we had never done. We started talking about systemic barriers. We were thinking about all the things that were just happening on the southeast side of Chicago, what was impacting us just internally, but hadn't really looked at the systemic barriers, even across the district, in a 7-college district, those barriers that were preventing students from being successful. And then we decided that we had to take institutional accountability. And so we started prioritizing data. One of the things that we really wanted to do was create a culture that was more acquainted with and comfortable with data. And I think that was our real turning point, was getting, very familiar and comfortable with the data, because numbers don't lie, right? And so our progress, or lack thereof at the time, relative to closing the equity gap, as when we started the work, was not promising, but it was also that pivotal moment where we realized that we had to do something. And so when I think about the last 6 years, and if I can, talk about 2 difference makers, I'll try to do that very succinctly. One of the things that has been really critical for us is intentional professional development and equity-minded leadership training. That was something that wasn't prioritized in the past. Faculty and staff are now engaged in continuous equity-focused training, such as cultural competency and implicit bias. My vice president, who I know is on the webinar, is a subject matter expert in microaggressions. He's led a number of workshops, and then we even started talking about inclusive pedagogy. And all of this helped shift our mindsets and build a shared language around equity across departments. I think that was most critical, is that shared language around equity. We all had our own understanding about equity, or what we thought it was, or, who was being impacted most. But I think we have finally gotten to a point where we do have that shared language. And then secondly, we went to a student-centered program redesign. Oftentimes, we think that we're here for our students, right? But when we look at our practices and our services and programs, they tell a very different story. And so the implementation of guided pathways and wraparound support services have been critical in advancing some of our outcomes. And so we've tailored them to meet specific needs of our underrepresented students. And that has significantly, and I talk a little bit about that, has significantly improved our retention and completion rates. I think I mentioned earlier before the webinar, Olive Harvey is experiencing its largest graduating class in the last 10 years, or maybe ever. And again, I attribute a lot of that to this intentionality around the equity work that we embarked upon back in 2020. And some of those strategic support services that we have been working on are like mandatory student advising, our cohort models, and a more holistic approach just to student success. We have a really good relationship with 1 Million Degrees, and scaling that work to support our students has really been a deal breaker. But I'm just going to be honest, we're still a work in progress. But our institutional commitment to create a data-driven culture has really helped in advancing our efforts.
Thank you, President Hollingsworth. Dr. Sumner, could you share a few of the top 1 to 2 difference makers in the equity work over the past 6 years at Northern Illinois University?
Yeah, I kind of want to scale to what President Hollingsworth shared in this notion of accountability. When we developed this plan, as it was created, one, we needed to recognize who our population was, and in acknowledging that, it was recognizing the shift from a predominantly white institution to now an institution that is predominantly minoritized or underrepresented students of color. And so when you can acknowledge that and recognize the importance of the way that we are considering diversity in the case of being not just students of color, but students who have all of these other identities, as we've talked about students at St. Xavier, who are traditional students with non-traditional responsibilities. If you don't understand those dynamics that are also in place, you're then working only to address one aspect of their identity. And so as we think about accountability, it's accountability through education. You make it something where people are empowered to engage in the change, not simply saying it needs to happen. And so as we worked within the Division of Academic Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which I oversee, has all of the cultural and identity-based services and programs. We also do the training and workshops across the institution. I have a dotted line to the president and a dotted line to the provost and a direct line to the president. And so we work in collaboration with our academic partners. I'm getting to this because the faculty have to have a role in recognizing the importance of this work. It is not only about those that are providing direct service as administrators, it's recognizing how we're addressing gaps in empowering faculty to look at culturally competent pedagogy in the classroom, inclusive approaches to teaching. How are we talking to them about what diversity looks like? And then how are they recognizing this in the curricular and in the research opportunities that we're providing to undergraduate students? In doing all of that work, you're also then trying to facilitate resources and services that are scalable. So it's the accountability and the scaling of these programs and resources. And we have, in higher ed, y'all know we've got 1,000,001 acronyms. We got the SET team, the SRT team, this team, that team. But I will say the student engagement team is the team that comes together to look at student retention. So the provost has built out her work in engaging those collaborative partners under her office. My division is then a part of that in student affairs. So we're working across the 3 divisions and saying, how are we scaling the use of data in the centers, in student affairs, and in the academic advising? Same data, different outcomes, with the opportunity to say, if we're looking at data and equity gaps in curricular experiences, then how in the centers do we work with the tutoring center to offer on-site tutoring in the cultural centers that meet the particular needs of a community that are available to all students? That's how you scale. Then looking at accountability, it's really being able to magnify that in different ways. So I would say accountability and scaling were 2 of the critical elements of the plan that we have been able to move forward in making it an institutionalized approach to this work. So that's what I would share.
Thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Carlson, what would you say were one or 2 of the difference makers in the equity work over the past 6 years at St. Xavier University? Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Carlson.
Excuse me. Clearly, number 1, it's leadership. Start institutional leadership. And I look at and I listen to the story that President Hollingsworth is talking and sharing. she epitomizes it. And we were blessed at St. Xavier to have a chief officer, the president, who not only approved, but was dedicated in principle to what we were trying to do. That has to be there. And that then gets to it was because of that commitment, we hired a chief diversity officer, Natalie Page, who has been fabulous in helping things, sets up structures and everything. You have to have that coming from the very top. So, and I think that was recognized when Lisa talked about what their whole strategy was, and even the beginning with PCC. The second thing I'm going to say, and you didn't pay me to say this, it was the ILEA group. I had been kicking around IR for a long time, as you might tell, and we had gathered mounds of data prior to ILEA, and had seen, especially a focus for me personally, was the negative impact of developmental math disproportionately on our students of color. And for years, tried to be the lone voice in the wilderness and never could get anywhere. When we joined ILEA, it coincided with a new presidency, Dr. Lori Joyner, who also was the key leader to get us started here. And for me, it was serendipity. So having the structure and the advice, the support from ILEA plus the new president, and we had already gathered lots of data. Now we were at a position to do it. I'll just say the third thing, and that Giselle and Mike mentioned it earlier in the presentation. You got to have the data capability, and you have to have the willingness of the institution to look at the data honestly. You can't hide it. It's going to go public anyhow. It's going to go in 2 years. It'll be in the public domain. So there has to be the honesty, but also the capability. Now, right now, we have 4 members in our IR department. When I came here, there was no IR department. And the president at that time, who hired me back in 1997, came from IR, which was an unusual path to the presidency. So he recognized we have to have that component. And half of our work at IR is supported on grant, but that's where we've been blessed. We've always had that capability to do that and to deliver. I'll stop here. I could go on, but I'll stop.
Thank you. So I'll send this next question to President Hollingsworth. How are students, especially those from historically marginalized groups, involved in shaping equity initiatives?
So I think our students are very vital to shaping this work. And one of the things that we have worked very hard on is empowering our students with agency. And the way that we've done this is by creating a safe and inclusive environment. I know we talked a lot about that, and that's usually built through mutual respect. And one of our initial ILEA goals was to find ways to really amplify student voice. And I keep hearing over and over, like, capacity to do this work. And similar to St. Xavier University, our institutional research team was only two individuals, and we most recently had the good fortune, understanding how important this work was to hire a data strategist so that we could glean from our students what their needs were. And so what our students do are they have a seat at the table. They're members of our shared governance councils. They're on our strategic planning committees. They're part of our ATD team. I meet with our student government committee regularly. And it's just that they're always present in everything that we do. Our students are the heart of the institution, and we recognize that, and we literally could not obviously live without them. So again, we've always wanted to have that capacity and bandwidth to not just find or to focus on the quantitative data, but that qualitative data. And so most recently, we have been utilizing focus groups and talking to our students to better understand what some of their needs are, where do they see gaps and challenges or inequity at the institution. And that has been really critical to how we move forward in developing equity programs and services.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Sumner, I know you touched on this a little bit, but could you talk a little bit more about the ways in which Northern Illinois University has leveraged disaggregated data to work on student success strategies, how you've democratized it with faculty, staff, and administrators to improve student outcomes?
Absolutely. We just recently I had a conversation with a dean. So, you can take it at the institutional level, and we've had a great person in Greg Barker who has led our IR efforts. That man has mounds of data. You could ask him to run circles, and he would. But we understand that it also goes to almost a nuanced level to the program or the college. And so the other day I was on a call with our dean of the School of Visual and Performing Arts. And we were talking about some of the things that he wanted to look at having someone to do an equity advocate in his college. And as we were talking about some of the data my colleagues in student affairs were using, I shared with him, they were looking at how many students were student leaders. And from that, how many courses were the students taking? What were the course loads? And the number of hours they might also be working, then comparing it to their grade point average to determine how we might talk to students about the number of hours they're taking in courses, working and balancing leadership. Because what we know about students of color and those from minoritized backgrounds is this strong sense of needing to be committed to the community and demonstrating a commitment to social action. Well, when you've got that balanced with taking a high STEM or STEAM related career trajectory courses, you've got students that will overcommit in many ways. They will be leading 3 or 4 organizations while taking these heavier course loads and finding that their grades are slipping. And so we wanted to be able to do that. Translating that into the college, he said, wow, we could look at that in terms of the numbers of students that are performing in theater or performances, because they will participate in an X number of shows. Are we looking at what they're taking in terms of courses? And to that extent, understanding the impact of what that looks like in terms of success in curricular offerings, graduation rates, and the rest. We've talked about this in terms of taking the same data, because we did equity on gateway courses. It was aligned to our accreditation process. We have now also said, how are we then translating that into the next iteration of what we're doing with accreditation, but also looking at co-curricular assessment? So within the Division of Academic Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, this is the first year that we are across the division doing an assessment related to our co-curricular planning that will be done every 2 years. That allows us to look at what is our impact on student success. It is not solely about we will say food, fun, and fetish. We should be contributing in ways that support students' graduation for time to completion for graduation. And those can be assessed in that way. So, President Freeman has been outstanding in terms of leading the charge with us and letting us be creative in the way that we're looking at data and expecting that we're using it in different ways. So just a couple of examples on how we have used it in different ways.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Carlson, would you also share some of the ways in which St. Xavier has leveraged disaggregated data to work on student success strategies?
Well, again, yes, thank you. A really primary driver for us has been Natalie Page, and she would have been here, but she was not able to make it today. She's our CDO. She's been vital in that. We've worked very closely with, she works very closely with IR. One of the things that was critical, the university developed at the president's behest, a University Institutional Effectiveness Committee, UIEC we call it. It meets every month throughout the academic, even through summer. So we meet all 12 months a year. It has a charter where there are specified individuals from faculty, from staff, and students come to it. But it's open to anyone to come. So that committee has really helped, I think, educate, share, stimulate. We generally have a good cadre of faculty and staff who are there on that part. So it keeps the IR office very busy, but because it's not stale data, because people will ask questions and I'll turn to my associate Jorge and say, okay, we'll deliver this in the next month. So there's a conversation that's going on. It's not just dry reports on that front. So that's been our experience so far.
Thank you. And this question, I think, we'll start with President Hollingsworth. Can you talk about the ways in which Olive Harvey College has engaged faculty in equity and student success work? And we always want to get to the heart of what happens in the classroom, because that's what can happen at scale in terms of our efforts as well.
Yeah, and I think that my colleagues have echoed the same sentiment, just how critical faculty are and the role that they play in ensuring equity. And what we've really been doing is just supporting them at what they do best. And that's teach and develop programs. And I think, Paula, you know this, and Lisa, I'm a storyteller, so I have a couple examples so that it resonates with people. Prior to my arrival here at Olive Harvey 7 years ago, our enrollment had been declining for over 10 consecutive years. And our largest decline was in our Black male student enrollment. And so again, what we looked at was leveraging that data and it told a not so promising story, that we were ultimately failing our community. This is a predominantly Black community. The household income is under $30,000 a year. And so, knowing that we weren't getting students of color enrolled and in programs that would help them improve their economic mobility, was very disheartening. So we took a really hard look at our programs and realized that we needed to offer programs and services that resonated with the population of students that not only that we were trying to attract, but also, get completed and retained. And so again, referring back to our ILEA goal, one of our primary goals was to create culturally responsive programming. And so that's really where that goal was born. We realized when we looked at our program reviews that our programs and some of our curriculum was outdated and really lacked the innovation to get our students to the next level. And so what we have afforded faculty, which I think is even more valuable than money sometimes, is space and time, which technically equates to money, to create culturally responsive curriculums. And I'm just going to talk about two ways we did that, just as an example. As a result, our college was one of the first colleges in Chicago to offer certification in cannabis studies. When it was announced that the sale of and use of recreational cannabis had become legal in Illinois, a group of faculty approached me and said, hey, look, we have Black and Brown members of the Roseland Pullman community, which have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And it is our college's responsibility to move these folks from the illicit selling of cannabis to learning about how to grow, produce, and sell cannabis legally. And there's lots of puns in cannabis, but this grew into our newly formed urban agriculture department that now offers degrees in cannabis studies, and many of those programs matriculate to some of our four-year institutional partners. That was one example. Another example of our faculty using their time and affording them time is during their sabbatical. And obviously sabbaticals can be used in a number of ways. Our faculty use it to complete research. They also use it to complete doctoral studies. But one thing that we have really been seeing is that our faculty are using their sabbatical time to come up with projects, programs, and services that improve outcomes for students. And I have a very promising example. Our criminal justice faculty member, Dr. Jeffrey Dillard, who is also an attorney, worked closely during his sabbatical with the Chicago Police Department. We all know that, there is a contentious relationship between Black and Brown individuals, the Chicago Police Department, but they also are seeing a decrease in the number of people who were wanting to become Chicago police officers. So our mantra was, hey, be the change you want to see. And Dr. Dillard created a one-year accelerated integrated criminal justice program in collaboration with the Chicago Police Department to get students educated more quickly and to fill the need for Chicago Police Department. But the caveat to that, and the real selling point, particularly as it relates to equity, is that the Chicago Police Department agreed to waive the entrance exam into the academy. And that may not seem like a lot to folks, but it's pivotal, because in speaking with the Chicago Police Department, we also learned that it is the biggest barrier to Black and Brown students entering into the police academy. And so to use that sabbatical to create a program that advances Black and Brown students, and, from a social justice perspective, helps the city in general, are just, a couple of examples of how, our faculty have been allowed time and space and money to help advance some of our equity work.
Thank you for sharing that. I know we're sort of winding down with time here, so I just wanted to do a quick lightning round of just final thoughts on being a part of the ILEA community of practice, and we'll start with Dr. Sumner.
Well, thank you. If you can see it in my glasses, I pulled up something because, again, some of the strategies that we've pulled away from this, we just launched a campaign, and it's called Husky 321. 3 steps, complete 3 steps in your first 2 semesters to reach one ultimate goal of graduating from NIU. And the 3 steps are: complete your English requirement, complete the Comms 100 speech course, and earn at least 24 credit hours. Much of that data comes and is tied back to our ILEA plan. So don't see these plans as something that are kind of set in concrete, that they are not something that you can continue to leverage, but understanding how these data and opportunities to engage with other peers gives you knowledge that even still we're benefiting from. So I'm just grateful for the opportunity that I could come in when I did, with this already in place, and be able to be a part of moving it forward. It's been a pleasure to be with you all today. Happy end of the semester.
Thank you. Dr. Carlson?
I just want to end here with a thought of we all know what's going on in the world around us. I think this has never been a more important time to recommit to what we're doing. And in terms of, I try to explain to people, our equity work is our retention work. Our equity work is student success work. And my concerns are the funding, threats to funding, some of the things we've relied on. So we're going to need to look at other sources, perhaps more private, and to keep things moving. And finally, I'll just say this. I think at St. Xavier, at least, we're getting to a point, we've done some reorging of our advising and different things around. But at the core of it is the academics. It's the course redesign. It's the mindset of faculty. And if I'd like to quote a good friend of mine, who was the dean here at St. Xavier, who really pushed through. We went cold turkey and got rid of the developmental math. And now she's a provost in another state. But she used to say, our faculty don't understand it, but they've been trained to be the, quote, guardians of their discipline. And Gina would say to them, and who's invading? So it's changing a mindset to say, do we believe everyone we have can learn? So that, I think, is our next big challenge. And it's not simple. It's not something you can just, snap a finger at. But I think those challenges in these hard times, but we have to keep to it. We've got to keep going or we no longer serve what we're trying to do. So.
Thank you for sharing. President Hollingsworth, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's just befitting to end with a simple thank you to the partnership. You all have been the best accountability partners. When I think about embarking upon this journey, and And we thought, initially we were going in blind. We had never done this work before, not understanding the level of support and community that we would have from the partnership. I think without that, we may not have been as successful as we are now. We really look forward to our meetings with Paula, who would check in, on a quarterly basis. We made sure that our agendas were intact, that we had updates to report, because we knew that not only were we accountable to the partnership, we are most accountable to our students. And so I just want to say thank you for being thought partners in this work, for allowing us to carve out time for committed conversations around equity, and stop making excuses about not having the time, because quite frankly, our work is just beginning. This work is never ending. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Well, thank you, President Hollingsworth, Dr. Sumner, and Dr. Carlson. At this point in time, I will turn it back over to Dr. Lisa Castillo-Richmond.
Just thank you to our panelists. I think President Hollingsworth, you absolutely said it. We also went in with a lot of plans, but we were blind to so many things that we learned together. I mean, I think that really is the message of all of this. But I want to thank you all. You are truly courageous, tireless, resilient, phenomenal leaders and equity practitioners. I'm so grateful to have learned from and with you, to call you and so many others in this work, literally hundreds of people across this state, colleagues and friends, and to stand shoulder to shoulder with you as advocates for students and equity and student well-being. I mean, this is really about people's lives. And there's just been so many people engaged in this over time. We've tried to elevate your work and elevate different institutions and elevate different practitioners in different departments across institutions over time, different types of institutions. And just, so much we have learned together and tried to elevate from the heroic work you're doing at the campus level. I'm really grateful to our staff at PCC who led this effort, Paula and the so many colleagues on the college and university partnerships team over the past 6.5 years. Many on all the different teams. All of my colleagues here have been working and supporting the institutions in so many different ways on this call and not on this call. And as a first-generation college student myself, who grew up in Illinois as an advocate and a scholar practitioner, I've had a chance to do so many things that are important to me while at PCC for the last 8 years, but nothing has been more instructive and meaningful to me than doing this work with all of you and our ILEA partners over the past several years. So thank you to you all and to our colleagues across the state. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We have a couple of slides. I do just want to say here that we've learned, right? This is the purpose of doing these webinars. We're going to write this up in a brief so that we can share this more broadly. But, organizations like PCC have a role to play. The state has a role to play, our state agencies. And of course, the rubber hits the road with students at the campus level. So how can we add value to your work? How can we be an accountability partner? How can we keep these long-term commitments moving forward? Because this work is never done. It is literally, and you all said this, the mission of our institutions is student success work. So how can we keep doing it better over time? So PCC is committed to that. As I mentioned, good state policy starts and ends at the campus level. So we need to be doing these things that impact students on the ground with all of you. We are going to lean in, as our colleagues Mike and Giselle shared, we are going to lean in a narrower number of areas so that we can have those student level impacts and we can just focus our efforts. We're going to be continuing to offer learning communities, integrating what we're learning on the policy side, creating a more robust, adaptable model. A lot of it will look like a continuation, but we want to engage those institutions that find value in working with us in these particular areas and be able to engage more institutions across the state that weren't able to join or were not in the place to join when we started this work in 2018. And thinking about what does sustainability look like? There are so many more things happening now, which is phenomenal. So how do we provide a unique service and support to our colleagues in Illinois? Slide. And really just think about this as a scalable model. I mean, you heard from us too. both institutions and PCC was limited by our capacity and scale. And so how can we, given our size, given our resource base, how can we be nimble and flexible to provide that value to institutions? Slide. I just want to end by saying that we, and our panelists said this as well, we are in a moment, but we are always in a moment. But we are definitely in an extremely challenging moment right now. This webinar today, as all my conversations with our equity practitioners do, it really shows how our work continues and is more important than ever. It is our mission work. Higher education is so many things to so many people. It is research and discovery, opportunities, careers, financial stability. It's about understanding ourselves in the world, and it is truly a different experience for each of us. And it's about creating spaces and places that work for all of the students in our institutions, and deeply engaging in these questions of how we can make our campuses better, but truly a better world with a more inclusive, more just, and more equitable democracy. It really is about all of those things. But we know, or we wouldn't be here talking about this, we know that higher ed has many flaws and has not worked well for every student that's attending higher education. We need to fix the things that don't work with our colleges and universities because we know how important it is. We also need to make college more affordable. We need to improve our graduation rates and make transfer more streamlined, because this will literally impact hundreds of students per campus or even thousands on some of our campuses. And the state has to do their part, and we must demand that. We need to increase investment in MAP grants so that we're not burdening current and future generations with a debt crisis, and so many other things. But higher ed is worthy of our time. It's worthy of our investment in making it better. It is essential, and this work is very difficult. We need each other to do this. We need to embrace each other and learn from each other. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for all the work that you do to make college better for our students. We look forward to continuing to work with you on the road ahead. Thank you.